Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Pleased to be joined this week by a very good friend, somebody who covers all sports at Indiana as well as anybody, Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star. Welcome back to the show, Zach.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I struggle with the mute button sometimes.
A lot of questions still out there about this college basketball season as we record this on the morning of Wednesday, November 11th. Hypothetically speaking, which I think this is what everybody thinks at this point, 2 weeks from tonight, there should be basketball in Bloomington at Assembly Hall. But as I kind of look at, there's a Twitter account that I follow that likes to track the schedules for college basketball. And as of this morning, I think 113 of the 357 Division I teams have released a schedule for the season. So just a little bit under a third of the country with 2 weeks to go has released a schedule. What have you heard to this point about when Indiana basketball may have a schedule? You know, I think you and I have heard kind of some of the same things originally, that we were going to have something maybe early November, and here we sit now a couple of weeks into November, and while we're pretty sure about the non-conference schedule, most of the games we've heard nothing really definitive on the conference schedule.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding as of just a few weeks ago, looking into things like the Crossroads Classic, was that everyone was just waiting on the conference schedules, to make sure that there weren't going to be major conflicts. I think there was possibly a bigger concern. There was some question of like, would conferences like the Big Ten front load their schedules into December and January? But I think there was an equal, if not larger, concern for conferences like the Big East, where a lot of schools share NBA arenas or NHL arenas, or both, Seton Hall, Marquette, Georgetown, St. John's in theory, if they want to play at the Garden, all programs that share an arena with, NBA and or NHL teams. And so I think everyone thought then, though, and again, this is going back to maybe mid-October, that broadly speaking, we weren't far away from having a conference schedule, and everyone was starting to sort of make conditional plans for things like the Crossroads Classic. And I think we've seen, the Crossroads hasn't kind of been nailed down yet, but we've seen some other games nailed down for that day. I think the Champions Classic is going to be that day, Michigan State, Duke, and Kansas, Kentucky. And that would suggest to you that date, either A, that at very least some of these schools have been given assurance that some of these weekend dates in December will be open, or B, people are just pressing ahead without it because, to your point, like, they got to know who they're playing, and they got to know how they, if you're Archie Miller, you're sitting here and saying, okay, when do we play and when do we travel, and what are we going to have to do when we travel? Is there any sort of, sequestration that we have to go through because of testing or anything like that? And, what's the kind of physical rhythm we need to build into our guys to be able to be ready for this game versus, this quick turnaround or that long layoff or whatever. It is kind of frustrating, frankly. And I know it's not this simple, but, you and I joked that the Big Ten released its hockey schedule yesterday. And, listen, the Big Ten has somebody separate working on the hockey schedule and the basketball schedule, but you do sort of look at it and say, okay, but like, basketball is the sport that everybody says needs to happen and needs to go forward and needs to be held this winter. where's the guidance on that? And I'm not really criticizing the Big Ten because most of the other major conferences are in the same boat. I think of the if you want to call it kind of the Power Six in basketball. Unless I'm mistaken, the only one that's out right now is the ACC.
I think the SEC might be out as well. But
okay. But still, the point is, it's not like some of these. It's not like most of the conferences are out and one or two are just lagging behind. And it's just sort of like if we're serious about having this season, we need to get this stuff together. I know it's hard. I know the Big East, I think, is still debating the bubble scenario of like bringing a bunch of teams together, playing it, testing them all in one day, playing one day, off day, playing another day, going back to your campuses for a week, that kind of thing. But it's just sort of like at some point we got to make a decision to move forward because, as you said, games are really not that far off here.
You brought up something interesting there that I was going to maybe bring up later, but I'll go ahead and just kind of ask you point blank right now. You mentioned the potential of a bubble situation with the Big East, and this is actually something I talked to my dad about a couple of days ago as we were kind of just thinking out loud and kind of maybe brainstorming how this season might work. And I brought up the potential for a bubble, and he kind of said to me, with all of the money right now that's kind of lost from these athletic departments, various leagues, how feasible financially is a bubble right now for college basketball? I mean, do you think the resources are even there? Like, let's say the Big Ten wanted to have a bubble for basketball. I mean, we're already looking at a season likely with no fans and a ton of lost money. Is it one of those things where maybe you just bite the bullet and pay for it just to have the season take place so you don't make it a total loss? Or is this something that you even think would be feasible in the event that something, that they would have to shift to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly for the bigger conferences, I don't think that's an issue. And especially when you realize that, just using the Big Ten as an example, the Big Ten now looks likely to recoup most or all of its TV money. You would imagine they'd be in a similar situation if they can get through college basketball season. And then obviously you also kind of have the partnership, if you want to say, of looking at the NCAA and saying, listen, when we ask for help, we're kind of going to expect some help because at the end of the day, this sport, getting this sport off the ground and through a full season is good for you as much as it's good for us, because the NCAA badly needs that tournament to be held in March. I mean, for financial reasons, certainly, but I forget who said this to me just kind of over the summer when we were having all of these sort of tense hypothetical discussions about what might happen to the college landscape without sports. Somebody said, that tournament is the most tangible thing anchoring the Power Five conferences to the NCAA. Without that, there's really nothing financial anyway, because the NCAA obviously has oversight in football, but it doesn't run football. It doesn't run the playoff. It doesn't run the bowl field. It doesn't run the conference championships. And if you go 2 years in a row of the NCAA not being able to make that tournament work, you just kind of get into, we've had so much discussion about norms in American political life. I think you start to have some discussions about norms in college sports. Do the Power Five conferences start to look at it and say, well, to your point about bubbles and testing and things like that, okay, the NCAA says they can't do this because all the smaller conferences couldn't afford bubbles, and I think that's the trickier thing, couldn't afford testing. They've had all sorts of COVID issues. They've shut down. None of them have completed full seasons. We just can't do a tournament this year. Well, if you're the Power Five or the Power 60, say, yeah, but we can. We've got 60 some odd, 70 some odd teams. We can find a way to make that work. And, we'll just do the rapid antigen testing backed up by the PCR testing, which I think everybody also expects to be a lot more accurate by February and March. And, we'll just hold our own tournament. And if you do that one time, and listen, come March, television executives are going to be desperate for an NCAA tournament of some sort. NFL season is going to be over. College football is going to be over. Nobody knows what baseball is going to look like yet. Obviously this is kind of a nuclear scenario, but I do think it's one where the NCAA is going to have to be actively involved in making sure, to your point, that people have the resources to get this done. Because if we get to March and the NCAA can't have a tournament, number one, that is just an unbelievable financial hit. Number two, I do think there might come a point where where the Power Six, or at least the Power Five, but maybe the Big East as well, would feel sort of compelled to basically hold their own tournament. And I don't think it would be altogether that hard for them to do it. It might be a little weird. We might see a repeat of the 1981 Elite Eight where Indiana gets to play at Assembly Hall for a chance to go to the Final Four. But I don't think it would be that hard, because all these schools have all that they need to play these games. They've got home arenas. What does Rupp Arena hold? Like 19,000 people? Assembly Hall holds 17,000 people. Okay, well, there you go. There's 2 regional sites, or there's 2 first weekend sites, whatever. I'm making all this up, but I really think that the resources are going to be an issue, maybe not for the big conferences, but the mid and low major conferences. But the NCAA is really going to have to step into that void a little bit, because it's on the NCAA to make sure that this season gets completed in something resembling a satisfactory manner. And quite frankly, it is very much in the NCAA's best interest to have that happen as well.
Yeah, and another point on that is you're going to have, and I think I talked a little bit about this with Chronic a couple of weeks ago when he was on, but you're going to have some in the national media who push back and say, well, things have to be fair across the board for the mid-majors and the low majors. But the reality of college basketball, since I've been covering it, is it's never been a level playing field, right? And this is just another example of, the Big Ten does have more resources than a smaller conference. They're going to be able to do the daily testing, and some of these other leagues simply aren't going to be able to. Is it fair? No. But in the situation that we're in, I think I agree with you 100% that the NCAA has a huge incentive to make the tournament happen, not just from the financial scope, but as you mentioned, if these leagues all play a full season and then at the end of the season, the NCAA says we're not having a tournament,
we're not, and you're not for the second straight year, you're not getting
your money,
right, 7-figure payouts from it. Then
they're going to say, what did we do all this for? So from a Indiana perspective on the non-conference schedule, I get asked a lot, and I'm sure you get asked too, kind of what is Indiana's non-conference schedule going to look like? And I just want to run through real quick what we know at this point. We think Indiana's going to play Tennessee Tech on Wednesday, November 25th at Assembly Hall. Tennessee Tech has, kind of announced that they're going to be playing there. Indiana, people there have not denied that game is going to happen. So that's kind of the opening game. The connection there is, I believe John Pelfrey, who played at Kentucky, was also a head coach, maybe
Arkansas. Either North or South Alabama before Arkansas, I think.
Tom Ostrom worked for John Pelfrey. So that game, and then we have obviously the 3 games for the Maui Invitational playing at Asheville, the game at Florida State, and then the Butler game. And the expectation, kind of from my understanding, is you've got Florida State on the 9th, and you've got Butler scheduled tentatively for the 19th. Is there will be one other bye type of game between those two at some point. And then I assume there's going to be Big Ten games at some point. It feels like a little bit of an ambitious schedule from an IU perspective, but also one that I think if they can take care of business and do relatively well, it sets them up for a lot of success. If they can just go into conference and have a decent season, and couple that with a pretty strong non-conference profile, it feels like this could be finally the year that Archie Miller gets his team into the tournament.
I think that's fair, and I think if there's maybe one thing we can learn from football about basketball, it's that it's we need to be careful about drawing sweeping conclusions before the season. What teams are going to get impacted by this? We haven't really seen opt-outs in basketball the way we have football, and that's interesting to me. But are there going to be teams that are more or less affected? Are there going to be teams that maybe handled COVID a little bit, that everything that kind of happened around COVID a little bit better than others? It could be one where, like Indiana football, Indiana basketball is at a bit of an advantage because you have an awful lot of institutional knowledge returning. You're not a young team. You're not a team where a whole bunch, like even last year, I said early in last season, I said, well, Indiana is not a young team maybe entirely in years, but it's young in roles. It's asking a lot of guys to do something, to fill roles they never really have before. You don't really have that this year. Obviously a guy like Christian Lander, maybe a guy like Jerome Hunter steps into a bigger role, Race Thompson. But, by and large, the team is the team for Indiana. And I think that as much as it's obviously hurt everyone, the way that kind of everything's unfolded in the preseason and the off season, I think Indiana is probably better positioned than most to handle, just kind of to roll with the punches, to torture a sports metaphor. And I think you're right. I mean, there was a time when I sort of wondered if all the big schools would just go for buy games, or not buy games, TV games. And I don't think that's realistic. I think the reason that you always, I know people roll their eyes at the Tennessee Techs or the Mississippi Valley States or I know Eastern Washington beat Indiana, but, the Big Sky team that flies across the country to lose to Indiana by 25. Part of the reason Indiana does that is obviously competitive. It's the chance to tinker with rotations and try different things and, whatever in a fairly controlled setting. Part of it, too, is Indiana's going to have a minimum number of home games because Indiana sets a budget line every year that says we need to make X amount of money out of our season tickets. We charge Y amount of money per game, and so we need Z number of games, knowing that we're going to sell this number of season tickets to meet that budget line, and to go above it to finish in the black in basketball. Well, that's not a consideration. I think you and I both agree that it would be really surprising at this point to see the Big Ten let fans into arenas. If the Big Ten's not letting fans sit outdoors at stadiums, and by the way, without wanting to get too far into it, I think we have some pretty compelling arguments why not now. I can't see a world where they're letting anyone other than family into arenas for, just a whole host of reasons. So you don't really worry about the home games. But at the same time, I think again, there was part of me that wondered, well, would all the big schools just line up heavyweight opponents that either they play, maybe even they play in their home arenas, but they just want it to be a big ESPN game or something like that. But the reality is that's not practical. From just sort of a day-to-day standpoint. And so I think it's not surprising to see a couple of those games in there, those guarantee games. But at the same time, the rest of it really is stuff that we knew Indiana was going to be locked into, and Indiana wasn't going to try to get out of. The Maui Invitational, obviously, the ACC Big Ten Challenge, it's a contractually obligated thing. Even the Crossroads, I know that Indiana fans have mixed feelings about it. I know you have mixed feelings about it. I think I've probably kind of come to a very sort of neutral ground on it, that I think from Indiana's perspective, it's probably not the most beneficial event in the world. I also just think it's cool and it's fun. It's not really going to seem cool or fun if you don't have families there, if you don't have fans in attendance. But again, I don't think that's going to happen. But Indiana's the host school in the Crossroads this year, so I can't imagine a world where Indiana would have backed out of that event or tried to get out of that event. So it is ambitious. But I think at the same time, it's also, kind of probably a pretty sensible schedule given everything we knew Indiana was going to need to be locked into this year.
In terms of the Maui Invitational, we've heard, obviously the Orlando bubble is not going to happen, which there was a ton of ESPN events that were scheduled to be played there. You've now seen teams pulling out of, I think Ohio State and Dayton have both pulled out of events in South Dakota. Are you surprised that to this point that Maui has been able to kind of keep everything together? I mean, we haven't heard a peep in terms of potential teams leaving that event. You got 8 schools, all from different conferences, all from different parts of the country, and that seems like it's at least to this point, full go. Has that been surprising at all? And is there anything you can point to and say this is a reason that this event was able to be kept together? Because there's very few of these kind of marquee early season events that are going to go on kind of with their original field intact.
Yeah, I mean, I think while admitting that I haven't kind of gotten into the details with the Maui people about the, what's going to be expected from the individual schools, the individual teams, I think there are a few things that work in Maui's favor. Number one, you're right, it's 8 teams from across the country, but it's only 8 teams. You're not sort of trying to cram a lot. It's 8 teams, and I think crucially, the apparatus exists to organize and execute this whole thing already. All the pieces were in place, and then COVID happened, and they felt like they needed to move it, that they weren't going to go to the islands. But unlike I think a number of those sort of Orlando bubble scenarios where a lot of that stuff was being planned, kind of over a very short space of time. I think probably sort of inspired, at least location wise, by the NBA bubble. Something like Maui, the all the structure that needed to be in place to just organize the logistics of that tournament already existed, and of course has for many, many years. Now, again, I don't know exactly what all Maui will be expecting from its teams in terms of testing and quarantining and things like that. And listen, we could be having this conversation, and then, I don't know, Providence turns up or Indiana turns up, and, there's 6 positive tests, and they have to back out and they have to quarantine. They can't play. And then, the whole thing is kind of blown apart a little bit. That's, I think, just a reality that everybody's going to need to get used to and get comfortable with, given the nature of COVID and everything we've seen already. But I do think that Maui has an advantage in terms of both being smaller and also not really having to plan any of the major details around this, kind of on the fly, beyond the what is the word I'm looking for? Beyond the obvious sort of, COVID protocols you've got to layer in, just how to get 8 teams in the same place, spread out their schedule, find places for them to practice, find places for them to stay, all that kind of stuff. Maui's got a bunch of old pros working on that. So I think there's a better chance of something like Maui being able to go off, Mohegan Sun, even maybe looking at this weird battle for Atlantis in South Dakota, although I think there's just a ton of different questions about it, given the public health situation in the Dakotas right now. But one way or another, I think you've got a better chance with something like Maui than what you would have had with Orlando.
So the interesting thing, and I like to, and obviously I don't want to turn this into a political discussion at all, because we're talking about just kind of these preseason events. But the interesting thing to me with Maui, and if you kind of look across the country, different states and different jurisdictions, local government, state, whatever, making a lot of decisions from a public health perspective based on cases per 100,000 people. And you look at Maui right now, based on some metrics, they're having actually less than 3 cases per 100,000 people of COVID. So in retrospect, you kind of wonder if everybody would have isolated and tested before, if that maybe would have been actually a safer spot for a lot of these teams to go to, especially when you look at, the fact that North Carolina, I think, is over 23 per 100,000, which is actually a lot better than a lot of places in the country right now. But we'll see how it all works out. But, I think a lot of these decisions were obviously made weeks ago before we had this current spike that we're seeing across the country. But in retrospect, it may turn out that Maui was actually a safer place for a lot of these teams to go and isolate than where they end up going. So just an interesting observation that I think kind of bears watching. But Zach, a couple other things news-wise happened this week. Or maybe last week, the first one, but, we have the AP poll out now for college basketball. We also have the KenPom ratings. I kind of like to compare the two just to kind of see from a kind of the human eye test and then what KenPom's thinking with his computer, looking at the Big Ten and its hierarchy entering the season. Iowa was the highest ranked Big Ten team in the AP poll at number 5, and in the KenPom ratings, Wisconsin was number 7, Ohio State in KenPom 10, which I'm not sure that I agree with that. Iowa at 12, and then kind of Indiana, depending on where you look, they're the 8th Big Ten team in the AP poll at number 30, which having 8 teams in the top 30 is obviously pretty strong. And I think they're also 8th in KenPom at 26, just behind Purdue. Any surprises to you kind of when looking at the AP poll when it came out? Indiana not ranked. I don't think I was expecting them to be ranked. I thought maybe they would just be right outside the top 25. But are you surprised at all to see them kind of in the 8th spot in terms of Big Ten teams?
No, honestly, I'm not, and I think you kind of I think I was thinking a lot of the same things you were, both in terms of number one, that Indiana would be somewhere on the fringes of the top 25, maybe 25th, maybe 24th, but really more as somebody who used to be an AP voter. I think the way that my ballot always wound up unfolding was I could get comfortably through about 21 or maybe even 22, and then like 23 to about 30. Was just kind of a who do you like, who's playing best right now, who's got the nicest recent wins, whatever metrics help you kind of break those teams apart and pick 3 out that deserve to be ranked. But you could, by the time you get to about 22, 23, 24, the reality is that a team that winds up 30th probably has just about as much claim on like being ranked 24th as the team that's actually ranked 24th. There's just not a lot to separate you by the time you get down that far. I also think you're right to point out just the sheer number of Big Ten teams. I've seen people who've said, Indiana picked to finish 6th, 7th in the Big Ten this year. Is that good enough? And it's sort of like, well, 7th in the Big Ten this year might still get you like a 6th seed. Like I have this suspicion that like we're going to get to. I don't think the Big Ten's as deep. Like I saw Richard Pitino saying the Big Ten could get 12 teams, 13 teams into the NCAA tournament. I don't know if it's you or somebody else who retweeted it and said this is usually what the coach of the 13th best team in the league says. But I don't think it's as deep as last year when we were talking about seriously about 10 or 11 bids for the conference. But I think that this is it's not hard at all for me to imagine the conference going 8 deep with teams that aren't even on the bubble. Like 8 deep with teams that are comfortably in the field for, let's say, the last month leading up to Selection Sunday. And then it's just a question of how they finish and therefore where they land. So like you could finish 6th in the Big Ten this year and genuinely still be on the top 5 seed lines. It's going to be a very tough conference. I think it's going to be a very good conference. I think it's going to be, strangely, it's going to be a conference where I actually think it's sort of well positioned for the better teams. And what I mean by that is there are enough good teams in the conference that there will be tons of opportunities for quality wins home and away. But then there's also maybe, obviously we'll see how schedules play out. But there's also, I think, enough bad teams in the conference that it won't feel like a 3-month gauntlet to get through the schedule. Like there will be enough sort of nights where you could say, okay, we can, it's, I guess not to pick on Chris Collins, but it's only Northwestern at home tonight. We can soft pedal a little bit. We'll still win. But I just, I certainly think Indiana is one of the 30 best teams in the country. I think there's a very, I can easily envision a world where Indiana is in the top 20 for most of the season. I don't think that's guaranteed, but I think that if Indiana kind of feasts on that non-conference schedule early, has a good trip to Maui, Asheville, as it were, and, maybe gets a couple of good conference wins on the board early in the season, then we're not even really having a discussion about Indiana as a bubble team. Indiana just is in the field, and it's just sort of a question of, well, what's their seed line? How high up the Big Ten do they finish? And what's their resume like on Selection Sunday in terms of seeding?
Yeah, I've kind of said, people have asked me expectations for this season, and I think at bare minimum, the expectation for Indiana should just be to get a favorable enough seed in the tournament to give themselves a chance to win a couple games, right? You don't want to be one of those teams playing in the first 4 in Dayton or just kind of barely getting in there in year 4 for Archie Miller. You want to be at this point solidly in the tournament, something like a 8-7 seed or higher. Give yourself a chance to win a couple games. And I think most people, if Indiana was able to get to the round of 32 or even the Sweet 16 this year, I think overall they would be able to look at that as progress and kind of moving things in the right direction. The last thing kind of I wanted to go over with you, and I believe you were a voter in this, the Big Ten announced its all preseason all conference team. I think a 10-man team, which I've always questioned why kind of this setup, like our basketball games played with 10 players on the same team on the court. It always struck me as kind of weird, but I kind of like to push, mash it up against what Dylan Burkhart and I did for UM Hoops and Inside the Hall, kind of ranking our top 25 Big Ten players. And there was actually some discrepancies in here. In our top 10, we had 3 players that didn't make it on the Big Ten preseason all team, and it was 2 players from Michigan, Franz Wagner and Isaiah Livers, and then Micah Potter from Wisconsin. Any surprises there from your point of view? I know we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit on chat about Potter. I'm obviously a little higher on him than you are, but Wisconsin did have some representation with Nate Reavers on the team. The one name that kind of keeps coming up for me that I look at on this list and say that they don't belong is Geo Baker of Rutgers. Obviously a solid player, but I don't think that there's any measure that you can look at other than maybe making clutch shots that suggest that he's a top 10 player in the league going into the season. So I'm just kind of curious for your feedback on kind of how you voted for that. If you did indeed vote and those 3 players being omitted, do you have any problems with any of those 3 guys not making it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember because I don't like the Big Ten doesn't send you a log of your ballot, but I definitely had Wagner on there. I believe I had Livers on there because I actually, our mutual friend Brendan Quinn helps organize the unofficial media polling every year. And I had Wagner in my first team, all Big Ten. And I toyed with Livers over Wagner, and I just I felt like it needed to be one of those 2 guys in my first team. And the rest of my first team was Garza, Jackson Davis, Io, and Kofi Coburn, which I don't think is any surprise. I'm with you on Geo Baker. I think he's a good player. I think he's a nice player. I think he's probably a top 15-ish player, top 20-ish player in the conference. I don't think he appeared near top 25. I also
we had him 18.
Okay. And I'll also say too, I tend to remove freshmen from preseason discussions. That's just always been the way I voted because I just, even when I look at like somebody like Romeo Langford, who goes on to have not a great freshman season, but I think given his injury, especially a perfectly solid one. I think when you're voting for preseason honors, you've got to, what you're basically saying is we're taking your body of work and transposing it against what we think you're capable of doing. And I just don't like factoring freshmen into that conversation. I think it's just sort of like, if this really is kind of about your resume and what's expected of you based on previous performance, then, the freshmen will get their due if they earn it at the end of the year with the all conference votes and things like that, which I think everybody cares more about anyway, obviously, because it's something more tangible. But I think I want to say my second team was something like Livers, Trevion, or the other 5, I guess. Livers, Trevion, Nate Reavers, who basically I think you and I think the same thing about 2 different players at Wisconsin when it comes to Reavers and Potter. And, we may both be right. We may both be wrong. Who knows what the season will tell us. I'm struggling to remember who my other 2 votes were, to be honest with you.
Aaron Henry, maybe?
Yes. I think it may have been Henry and Carr. I'm not positive on Carr, but Aaron Henry was definitely in there. And I just, I'm with you in the sense that I think 10 is kind of weird. I just broadly speaking think that it's the way the conference has gone in terms of saying, we don't want to do all conference teams. We don't want to pick an order of finish. It just sort of seems silly. It's like, well, then why are we doing this? Just ask everybody for a preseason player of the year. Like that. Just say like
this morning put out its top 15 in men's basketball is voted on
right.
in the media. Like,
and the Big Ten used to do that. And then it backed it down to like top 5 and then top 3. And they used to do first and second team all Big Ten preseason. Now it's just basically this 10-person honor roll, and it's kind of similar in football as well. And again, it's just sort of like if we're going to do this, let's do it right. And if we're not going to do it, then just ask everybody for a preseason player of the year and a preseason champion, and that's it. Like don't get over the rest of it, because it's not a ballot at that point. But one way or the other, like I said, I'm with you on Baker. I think there's probably a little bit of sort of Rutgers romance behind that. Everybody recognizing what Steve Peichel's done at Rutgers, and obviously, in all likelihood, they would have made the NCAA tournament last year. It would have been the first time since, I think, 1991. And I think everyone expects big things of them this year, though I won't lie. I'm a little bit – I have some reservations about Rutgers going into this season, just how much more they can evolve as a team. But one way or the other, I think – I mean, listen, I tend to use – your list to kind of help me refresh my memory when it's time to vote for all Big Ten preseason, all Big Ten stuff, just because, other than maybe the Ios and the Garzas, and then obviously anybody that plays for Indiana or Purdue and therefore is closer to home, in the off season, I just kind of lose track of what guys have done in their profile. So, it's, again, you look at those lists. I mean, there's a couple of guys that really ought to be in the NBA draft, and I respect the fact that they aren't, but I'm saying that's how good the conference is going to be, that you're getting a guy like Garza back, or you're getting a guy like Io back. You even go down the list, and, I'm not sure in every single year, I'm not sure in a completely normal year, Trace Jackson Davis or Aaron Henry are back. Maybe they are, but I think it's a lot more 50-50 than it winds up being for those players, particularly Trace, who doesn't even declare. I think that the Big Ten is going to be a particular beneficiary, if you want to say that. I think everyone understands, I'm just talking about sporting reasons and recognizing that COVID is way more important than sports. But I think the Big Ten might wind up being particularly well done by maybe just the weirdness of this offseason, leading some guys to just say, what, I'm not going to take too much of a chance. I'm just going to go back to college.
Zach, we appreciate the time. You're obviously busy right now with football. What's that been like so far to kind of, Indiana football 3-0 ranked in the top 10? It's not something I can admit that I ever saw coming, but it's got to be. It's
not something either of us have ever been alive for.
Right. I mean, what's it been like? I'm just curious from a media perspective, going to these games without fans. Obviously, there's some family and friends type people there, but that's it. I mean, what's it been like covering the games, at least the ones at home so far, and kind of what's the outlook for the rest of the season? Obviously, Indiana's kind of on cloud 9 right now. Do you see a potential stumbling block this weekend at Michigan State?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of work backward, I do think this weekend is a test for Indiana. I think Indiana is better than Michigan State. I think Indiana should beat Michigan State. I'm not even sure it's that close, to be frank. But at the same time, what I've said is, when you talk about seeing it coming, when people have asked sort of, did you think this was possible? I said, well, in one sense, no, but in another, they didn't win 8 games last year, and they returned an awful lot of production from 2019 to 2020. So, it shouldn't be surprising that this is a really good football team. It was a good football team last year, and then it didn't lose very much. I think the thing is, there's kind of these two sort of parallel comparisons, if you want to say, in recent Big Ten history. One is Gary Barnett, Northwestern, Ron Zook, Illinois, where you basically just catch lightning in a bottle for a season. All the breaks go your way. You wind up in the Rose Bowl. It's great. It's not sustainable. The other is sort of the Barry Alvarez, Joe Tiller. And obviously Alvarez maybe hits higher heights than Tiller does, but it's the same idea, where actually what's being built is foundational and has roots and can be sustained. There's a dozen different things that go into being Barry Alvarez and not Ron Zook, but including just, coaching talent. But one of them is winning games like this, where you're coming off an emotional win against Michigan. You would be forgiven for looking ahead a little bit to Ohio State. Big game next weekend if you win. But making sure you find a way to stay focused on Michigan State and win this one and don't get tripped up by this one. That is evidence of more of a winning culture. Now, I will also say, just more generally, and I'm not pouring cold water on what Indiana's done, I do wonder what the lack of crowds has done for these games, because I think one thing we've learned is that crowds tend to, sort of have this impact where the emotion of a crowd and the energy of a crowd almost guides a game, essentially. And without a crowd, and we've seen this a lot, I think, in soccer, I think we've seen it to some extent in football. Without a crowd, the atmosphere is obviously sterile, but the game really just becomes much more sort of blunt, or much more sort of stark. It's just, are you better than the team across from you? You use the Penn State game as an example. If there's fans in that stadium when Indiana goes up 21-7 or 20-7, I think it was 20-7, that place is going nuts. And maybe Indiana feeds off that and gets one or two, gets 10 more points and puts that game away. Maybe Indiana makes a couple more big plays, buries Penn State and wins that game. But also, if there's fans in the stands, when Penn State comes back and makes it 21-20, does suddenly all the nervous, negative energy in the stadium freeze Indiana up? I just don't know. And so I think that what you're seeing is almost basically more just a question of, if there are no fans, then it really is just down to who's the better team, who's more talented, who's more disciplined, who's better prepared, who's better coached. And I think you certainly saw that Saturday against Michigan. And I think, if you're Indiana, the question again is just, can you sustain your focus as the interest and the intensity and, the moment all grow? Because, let's say Indiana does manage to win this weekend. I mean, they will be playing in the week after that at Ohio State, they will be playing in the biggest game the program has seen since 1967. So, it's just, can you handle that too? But then again, are you helped in handling that by not having fans there, by some of the drama of it being removed and it just being allowed to be sort of you and your teammates going out and playing, not worrying about atmosphere, not worrying about energy, not worrying about road environments, whatever, just being able to go out and play. I just don't know, but I think it's fascinating. And I think certainly, from a journalist perspective, you don't cheer for wins and losses, but you cheer for good stories. And this is a good story. It kind of reminds me a little bit of IU basketball in 2011-12. And obviously Kentucky's kind of the headline moment that year, but people forget Indiana beat number 2 Ohio State on New Year's Eve that season. They beat top 5 Michigan State. They obviously had a sort of an exhilarating NCAA tournament win over a really good VCU team. There are seasons where it just kind of everything bounces your way. And it's fascinating to watch teams and try to sort of chronicle how teams handle that success when it comes, when it hasn't necessarily been there, for a long period of time before.
Follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Read his work at indystar.com and also in print too. Don't forget, people, newspapers still in print, so pick one of those up as well. Zach, thank you as always for joining us. Hopefully next time we have you on, we will actually be talking about IU basketball and its performance this season so far in some form. So looking forward to that, and we'll be back once again in a couple of weeks with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thanks everybody for listening.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me as always.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.